Hey everybody, so we're going to get started on chapter 6, and this is part of module 2. And we'll just kind of keep going where we left off last time. And chapter 6 is really this idea or exploring this concept of colorism. And it's that the idea that when we talk about races specifically, or when we talk about people and their skin tones, that the lighter they are, the closer they are to the top of the hierarchical structure, and that people will work to try to achieve lighterness, a lighter skin tone in order to appear higher on that particular hierarchy. And so this is directly kind of linked to that beauty standard of Western ideas of beauty as being a white, thin woman who is very petite. Um, and I mean, you could think supermodel, and generally the image that has been transposed to us and has been told to us over and over and over again is going to be this really thin white woman. That's not to say that there aren't beautiful people outside of that spectrum. Obviously, there are. But it's to say that that's the beauty standard that is put in front of us and regularly told women to live up to, especially. And that's not to say that there's not beauty standards for men too, because there are. And generally, those are also into that white, blue eyes, um, blonde hair, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so race is definitely tied into this. And they talk about a beauty cue as a concept explaining how sexism and racism interact to create a cue of woman ranging from the lightest to the darkest, in which the lightest get the most rewards. And by rewards, they're talking about social interactions. They're talking about privileges when it comes to being hired, privileges when it comes to getting promotions, or privileges when it comes to how much you might. I'm sorry, I need to wake up. Um, how much you might get paid as an actress, maybe how much time you'd get, or how many jobs you'd get, whether or not you'll get the modeling gig or be able to talk about makeup, whether or not you'll be able to find makeup that fits your complexion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's built into several of our institutions, right? It's built into our media institution for sure. It's built into our education system. It's built into the way in which we interact in a peer-based situation. It's built into how we view the potential partners we pick, et cetera, et cetera. But it's also linked to very discriminatory practices. It's linked to whether or not you'll get hired, whether or not you're more likely to get disciplinary acts, whether or not you're more likely to get pulled over by the police, whether or not you're more likely to get judged more harshly in a judicial system, et cetera, right? So the range of skin tones also has a very complex interaction with multiple institutions and with multiple different social practices amongst our society. And because of that, we have something called skin color stratification, which is just resources such as income and status are distributed unequally across skin color, right? And we already knew that. We were already talking about that when it comes to the different kinds of racisms that we have. But it can be directly linked to, even within a racial category or something you might be categorized as those lighter skin tones are even preferable within the racial category. And that's something that you see a lot when you think of, I'm trying to give an example. So I'm going to go back to media because it's the easiest and it's most prominent example, right? The closer someone gets to white, the more likely they are to achieve success. So even as a person of color, there's still a lot of lightening that happens in photographs, in any kind of imaging. There's your lighter skin actors are going to be more likely to achieve roles even as people of color, et cetera, et cetera. Um, so there's also um, this link to where society has created a system that where Black, Asian, and Latinx people have different social statuses due to their skin color. And this is not just within the US, this happens globally as well. So um, there's a lot of products and a lot of specific cosmetic um, purchases you can make that will help with creams and things of that nature to make your skin lighter or to appear lighter. These can do irreparable damage, and that's something that we'll talk about too. But specifically, these are marketed within any kind of Latinx populations, Asian populations, and Black populations. And they have been throughout multiple generations. We're talking back into the early 1900s and on, and we'll kind of get into that. But these people have very different social statuses due to how light they can make their skin appear, how light they can appear, and how closely they can mix and mingle with um, people within a white racial category that is surrounding them. So they talked about, I think, in your book, Harlem in the 1920s, 30s, where there were a lot of individuals who are biracial or mixed racially, and because one or more of their parents had either different races or they also had more than one race themselves. And what this caused was this very hierarchical structure where the closer to white your skin was, the more elite you were allowed to be within this Harlem area. And the more likely you were to be able to fit into a specific type of social setting, the social clubs, the elite schools, et cetera, et cetera. And we're going to talk about this in the next chapter, so in chapter 7. But there are many classifications, and there's a lot of concern as we continue to move on and continue to keep these categories of race as to where people fit that are, or where they would even ascribe themselves to be as someone of any kind of mixed racial heritage. Not to mention the fact that inevitably most racial categories have a level in which they are, they wouldn't be able to fit specifically in one category. And I say that because you have a lot of, there was a lot of, right, like we're not multiple species as humans. We're just people that have a different variance of color skin. And because of that, even within countries where you might find predominantly Latinx people, you're still going to find people that are culturally different. You're still going to find people that are, you're always going to find indigenous people no matter where you are in the world. There are indigenous people that are native to those lands and or have been pushed into those lands. And that's going to mean that at some point during the colonialistic process, these different skin toned people interacted, had children, were made or forced to have children, et cetera, that led to all these different distinctions in color that we have as humans. Not to mention there are and continue to be ecological factors that push and meld and promote different kinds of skin tones in different kinds of geographic regions. And so this is something that makes it, again, one of those things that proves to us that really these racial categories are social categories that we construct and we mold and we shape differently in order to create this hierarchy within society, as opposed to very concrete categories that we can point to several specific things and say, well, you fit in this category, because that's that's just not possible with the way human migration happened and the way in which humans interact with each other globally. All right. So, and we'll talk more about those classifications itself, but really, as early as we started really making classifications, mulattoes and hypo-descendant were really conversations surrounding what kind of distinction we will give people who had one parent who was Black and one parent who was white, etc. And that those individuals with mixed racial backgrounds, what kind of political, economic, and social benefits and or consequences will they have for this particular feature about themselves. And that's something that has ebbed and flowed as we went throughout history, but it's something that generally had kind of a negative connotation and increased the likelihood of discrimination. All right. So, as I said earlier, when we talk about colorism, we can't talk about colorism without talking about the cosmetic industry. And that's because there is just so much an overabundance of products geared towards bleaching the skin, geared towards straightening your hair, geared towards making someone, even contact lenses, making someone look and appear more within that European white racial category in order to create or maintain some kind of social status that is higher up on the hierarchical structure. But these products have a lot of really damaging like they also have a lot of really harmful chemicals in them, really harmful. The processes themselves can actually do harm, such as burns. It can cause pigmentation issues. It can cause a whole host of health concerns. And because of that, it's something that as globally has been a predominant issue within any kind of feminist and or racial movements to kind of stop this depiction of darker skinned people as being unpretty, unworthy, undateable, et cetera, et cetera. And that has still severe lapses because there's very distinct parts of the world, and we're going to get into that a little bit in the next slide, but where this is still an incredibly big market, an incredibly thriving business practice that continues to have very discriminatory ad practices, very discriminatory motives behind it. Trying to think of another way to put this. And it's predominantly again in those Black, Asian, and Latinx markets. And we'll talk about some of the countries within certain parameters and how frequent and how prevalent these conversations are. I also, in another class that I teach, do a particular lecture on a article specifically talking about this phenomenon, this global problem. So if this is something that you are interested in or something that you might think would be an interesting topic for our project towards the end of the semester, or you're just kind of want to know more about it, I can get you those lectures if you guys would like them. We also talk, when we talk about colors, and we also talk about Latin America a lot, and that's because the Latinx category tends to be a relatively lumped category where essentially anyone who speaks Spanish gets thrown into it, as opposed to all these different cultural variations and all the different countries in which people originate, or even religions that are practiced, and that has an extensive that's an extensive group of people. And what happens is you end up with very like varying ways to which then those categories have to be broken down. And when you look at several of the Latin American countries, what you end up finding is this very coloristic um, map kind of shaping the way in which social interactions happen in a very real way, where Afro Latinx people end up being discriminated against quite a bit more. And that the darker these individuals are, the more likely they are to be seen as indigenous, be seen as even considered savage, considered less um, civilized. And these messages have continued throughout the course of some of these countries' histories and have left really lasting marks on their social system and continue to. Um, and even when they immigrate to other places, you're still seeing that discriminatory practice. And so it's something that as people are walking through the world globally, it's something that doesn't necessarily go away even when they cross country borders. Um, Asia has a long history of colorism. And again, Asia is one of those really big categories that engulfs a wide variety of people. Um, and we'll use India as a really good example in the sense that India has a class system that is distinctly based on the color of your skin and has for a long time been based on how to, um, that the lighter your skin is, the more likely you are to achieve, like you are closer to God, you are closer to perfection, etc. And it's built into the social structure that you want to marry someone that is lighter than you or that is at least equally as light as you, because if you are born with a fair skin, you are allotted more opportunities, um, more economic possibilities due to the way in which hiring and firing happens, and etc. And so these are things that again are, and these are just examples of how global this conversation about colorism is and how it works differently in different countries. Now, there is a conversation surrounding, there are places where darker skin and are socially more acceptable. Places in Africa, places in on islands, depending on where in the world you are. And those particular places generally lack and or butt up against their colonialistic neighbors and or the colonialistic practices that have shaped and molded some of the rest of the world. And so that's kind of important to think about. So we're going to talk a little bit about, again, these cosmetic practices of the lightening of the skin. And again, that includes everything from just makeup you're putting on to laser-based treatments um, to like chemical washes, et cetera, to try to take out the pigment of your skin. And these are extremely pervasive. When they talk about on page 181 in your textbook, they went through several countries and their percentage of the women who have used the products. And in Nigeria, it was up close to 70%. In Senegal, it was close to 66, et cetera, et cetera. This is not like, hey, a tenth of the population is having these conversations. This is the majority of people, of women are having these conversations. And the rationales for that really range in a wide in a wide way. Like they're considered acne removing measures. However, that has mixed actual like success rates when it comes to actually if this tests and is clinically approved for these things. It softens the skin. They want to be more white. They want to remove dark patches in their skin. They want to attract men and or impress peers. So there's anything from this very clinical acne removal to very social desire to be lighter in order to um, impress and or present themselves in a higher stature, if that makes sense. Um, Again, this has it creates a lot of opportunities for these women, but it also has a lot of consequences because it also is reinforcing that fact that the darker you are, the less appealing you are. And that in and of itself is, a self-replicating cycle. And so it's really going to create a situation that uh, continues to feed on itself and continues to feed on those narratives and media and the way that they advertise for these things. Again, fight into that fear of possibly not being accepted or being isolated or being um, called out or ridiculed for having darker skin. And so that's something that it's really important that we talk about the social aspect of these practices, because without change in that social aspect, the likelihood is these practices will continue. I already talked about that other media lecture. There also is a really important conversation within racial categories or minority racial categories, where there's a lot of discrimination against or amongst individuals um, due to the fact where their skin color may lie comparatively to their peers or to the people they're around. So in Black communities, the more fair skin you have, there might be this idea that you don't fit in the Black community, or that you feel ostracized in both the Black community and the white community if you have parents or one of each. And so it's really, the concern becomes, at what point, you know, are you Black enough? Are you white enough? Are you this enough? And that creates really, really dangerous and concerning social dynamics, because it ends up putting individuals of any kind of mixed racial backgrounds into very isolated groups, and is another way in which it causes social isolation and discrimination. Um, there's obviously a skin color privilege. I think they used I can't remember what the actor's name is, the guy from, what's the name of, McDreamy, what's the name of the doctor show? Greg's Anatomy. There we go. I got it. And so when they when they talk about him particularly, he's talked about how having the bright blue eyes and the lighter skin as a person of color allotted him the ability to cue into some of that more privileged interactions, those racial privileges that come towards being lighter skinned. And that required a bit of um, acknowledgement for him to acknowledge that, hey, somebody that maybe has brown eyes or whose skin was maybe darker, even though they would be considered the same as a person of color, they're going to experience the world in a bit different than I am. And I'm going to be allotted certain privileges because I am lighter skinned than they would. And it was a good example to hear his own words, to hear how that played out in his life, and the fact that he recognized that. You're also going to talk about something called erotic capital, which is really just this idea that depending on where your skin color is, where your features are, there can be a way in which these are sexualized or overly described as sensual, and you get put into this sexually promiscuous stereotype due to the fact that your skin is darker. And over the course of history, there's been a long conversation or a long discrediting of women, especially of color, as something to be eroticized. And so, um, while it may have this this ability to kind of gain a certain level of appeal, it's done so in a way that can be really toxic and is still built on this hierarchy of, well, you're still less than, you're just less than and possibly desirable because you might be promiscuous or be considered um, a novelty or something of that nature, which is really toxic, right? Because um, describing an entire community as, or an entire identity as sexually promiscuous in a way also delegitimizes any kind of survivorship they might have, or their ability to seek justice in times when they are harmed in specific ways. And so, and we'll get into that again more when we talk about our judicial system. But it's something to think about, the ways in which that particular feature of colorism impacts um, the lives of those around them and their ability to claim survivorship and um, claim the harms that are done to them. Now, again, there's this really strange, when we talk about this line between erotic and exotic looking and too dark, and where that line is depends and varies depending on culture, depending on media, depending on um, where you are globally, etc. But that idea that there's this line where no matter what, if you cross it, you're still too dark, um, you're still outside of that realm of what we consider socially appealing, is really, again, really, really toxic. Um, there is some pushback. Obviously, there's a lot of pushback. There is a consistent pushback within certain medias, within certain groups. There's a great example in your book, the hashtag not fair and lovely, and it's the untraining of white as beautiful, a beauty standard in Muslim communities in London. Now that, as far as I am aware of, has actually expanded past London and has become more of a social movement than that, especially as we hunkered down during COVID and many people turned towards internet and to create social spaces and have more conversations surrounding that. And so, as far as I'm aware of, that has actually expanded. But they also critique, and I think this is something that's super important, they're critiquing that idea that beauty is at the center and quality of the worth of specifically women generally, but of people in totality. And that if we tie worth back to appearance, then what's going to end up happening is these processes where we are changing ourselves intentionally to meet some kind of beauty standard that is unobtainable for the vast majority of people, then what you do is create situations where cosmetic companies can do things like these skin lighteners and can continue to feed on that fear and those insecurities and those notions of isolation, social isolation, if you don't meet that beauty norm. And that's really where I'm going to stop here. That's the end of chapter 6 and really the big main talking points. Again, if you guys are interested in more talking about the cosmetic industry, more talking about specifically some of the countries, some of the countries that have this problem, but also some of the cosmetic actual companies that create and continue these really bad advertising practices, there is a lecture on that that I can get to you. So just shoot me an email and I will put that one up too. I hope you guys are having a great week and I will talk to you again soon.